Good evening, everyone. I have been hearing some very exciting stories from today's lobby visits, but our first order of business this evening is to present the Edward F. Snyder Award for National Legislative Leadership in Advancing Disarmament and Building Peace. And it is my distinct honor to be able to present that this evening to Senator Richard Lugar of Indiana. The Edward F. Snyder Peace Award is presented annually to a member of Congress who has displayed leadership to advance legislative priorities consistent with those advanced by FCNL. Beyond your pivotal role in reducing the danger of nuclear war, our entire community appreciates your statesman-like approach to international relations, your focus on building international structures of cooperation, and your willingness to work across partisan divides to craft policies in the public interest. All of us at the Friends Committee on National Legislation are extremely grateful for your steadfast work towards nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. The collaborative partnership between FCNL and your office has helped the peace community come closer to a nuclear weapons-free world. This would not be possible without your work. Please come forward to receive the award. I'd like to read the citation on the award. The Friends Committee on National Legislation presents the Edward F. Snyder Award for National Legislative Leadership in Advancing Disarmament and Building Peace to Senator Richard Lugar. We congratulate Senator Lugar on his exemplary leadership in promoting nuclear weapons reductions and disarmament. We honor Senator Lugar for these efforts over 20 years in the U.S. Senate. We particularly applaud the Nunn-Lugar program, the ratification of the New START Treaty, and your efforts to craft bipartisan support for arms control programs that make our country safer. Senator Lugar is living out the courage of his convictions in a manner that is a model for all of us. We need more public officials who follow his lead. Signed the 16th day, 11th month, 2012, at the 69th annual meeting of the Friends Committee on National Legislation.
Oh, thank you very much.
So Senator Lugar has agreed to say a few words, and I think if he has adequate time, maybe answer a few questions. So, please.
Well, I thank all of you. This is really a wonderful moment in my life to be with Mr. Snyder as my companion this evening, to shake his hand, to think through the wonderful, distinguished list of forebears who have been given this award. I am deeply grateful. And I would just say that I thank especially the Friends Committee on National Legislation each day for dedicated work on disarmament policy. Already we have heard about the New START Treaty and the difficulties in 2010. They were very real. The New START Treaty was a difficult political battle from the beginning that had to be won for the national security of our country. And I thank you for your support throughout the last 21 years for the non-nuclear cooperative threat reduction program, which came at a totally counterintuitive moment in history. Without going through all of the background of this, I would say imagine the time that Russians came here to Washington, met with Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia and myself, and these were Russians that we had been visiting with for 5 years from the Geneva talks onward, and said, "We need your money." We need your expertise. We even need some of your troops because the Soviet Union is falling apart. We're bankrupt. There is a lack of security around these facilities where the nuclear weapons are located. And you folks have spent in the United States trillions of dollars trying to contain this for 40 years in so-called mutually assured destruction. Now the dilemma is that officers who are not getting paid might very well begin distributing some of this for money to other countries or other groups. It was an awesome situation in which a great superpower, after this 40 years, is saying to us, we want your help to disarm. But it was a moment that we seized, and we were very fortunate in the very last days of the November session of 1991 to pass the first resolution of cooperative threat reduction. And without, as I say, going through the whole history of 21 years, it has been a remarkable period for the world. Whatever may be the threats to our country at this time, and there are numerous ones, and I do not diminish the foreign policy dilemma. The fact is that whether we knew it or not, as I was back in Indiana, as mayor of Indianapolis, for instance, Indianapolis was on the target for annihilation. As I descended into one of the silos one time in Siberia, I saw on the 13th floor down pictures of American cities, all of them targets. Every large American city, quite apart from every large military installation, was the target for one of the 7,500 warheads that we have now taken down and disassembled. And so we're grateful there were no accidents. We're grateful somehow or other there were not mislaid orders. We still have enormous problems in the world, and as already has been suggested tonight, we're trying to move now from 2,200 weapons left down to 1,550 or so each, and hopefully even faster than that if I'm able to be of any guide in all of this sort of thing. But now let me just say, we are at a critical moment for the future of arms control. I don't want to overstate that, but Congress has not shown inclination to support new arms control initiatives, and Russia has now sent negative signals regarding its willingness to proceed on several fronts. Among the most troubling signals were recent pronouncements. These were press accounts by Komissart and other publications in Russia that Russia would not renew the non-Lugar program agreement next year when it expires in June. Non-Lugar has facilitated, as we've mentioned, the safeguarding and destruction of more than 7,500 nuclear warheads and thousands of delivery vehicles. In my judgment, the program has been a great success, and dismantlement of many of the largest Russian weapon systems has already occurred. But failure to carry on the process of non-Lugar with Russia would be a big mistake. And there are still many, many goals left to achieve in Russia itself, quite apart from elsewhere in the world. Moreover, non-Lugar has been a stabilizing factor in our relationship with Russia for 2 decades. It facilitated close ties with members of the Russian military. It has been a fountain of diplomacy and reduced suspicions. It also approves the possibility of joint Russian projects with the United States outside of the former Soviet Union. In fact, when I was in Russia in August of this year, I explored the possibilities of joint Russian-American efforts to safeguard Syria's chemical weapons stockpiles. I'm hopeful that Russian and American authorities will find accommodation to continue the non-Lugar program in some form. And from my conversations with the Russians, I believe this is certainly possible. One point that many observers do not fully understand is that non-Lugar is no longer just about Russia. About a decade ago, I passed legislation that expanded the scope of the non-nuclear activities so it could target any weapons of mass destruction anywhere in the world. For example, the non-nuclear program was used to destroy chemical weapons stockpiles in Albania. There was a strange time in which reports came from the Albanians that there are some strange looking missiles up here in the mountains above Tirana. Hard to tell how they got there and exactly what they were, but I went over with people from the Defense Department, and they commissioned putting fences around them. In due course, working with Germans, we had technology that, in fact, extracted all of the nerve gas from the shells and rendered them useless, which led the president of Albania to want to have a great celebration, declaring Albania was the first weapons-free country in the world. Well, currently, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, which now runs the non-nuclear program in the Department of Defense, has initiatives in more than 24 countries in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. And these initiatives seek to work with local governments to enhance the protection around chemical agents, biological strains, and other material that could be used to manufacture a weapon of mass destruction. They also involve the detection and interdiction of weapons of mass destruction materials that might cross borders. In 2010, November of that year, I traveled to East Africa, to Kenya and Uganda in particular, to help DITRA open a relationship with those nations. Our ongoing goal has been to ensure the safety of biological research labs that house some of the deadliest pathogens in the world. Before the non-nuclear program engaged these countries, these labs, which were by and large wooden sheds with very humane doctors in them, taking blood samples from animals that were lined up outside so that cells of Ebola or Marburg or anthrax might be extracted and put into pathogens that might eventually lead to immunization possibilities in the case of a plague. I would just say that it was awesome to see these dangerous pathogens simply put in an ice box with a lock on it and no other defense around it. So my purpose there, and I was sent by the Defense Department because they felt perhaps I was mild-mannered enough to be able to work this thing out, was to visit with the governments of Uganda and Kenya. Say, we're not violating sovereignty, but we have a joint thought here, the need for safety. And this they agreed with, and so we have now gotten those safety procedures and moved, at least in other African countries, to do the same. It is an ongoing process, which many people who have followed the nuclear situation do not realize the dangers of the chemical and biological situations, which could be carried around with much less difficulty than a nuclear weapon, a missile or a warhead. Although through the non-nuclear program, we've built tremendous capacity to address these threats before they reach our shores. We need to preserve and to improve this capacity if we want to live in a secure world. One of the lessons that I've learned after decades of promoting national security through arms reduction is that the business of arms control does not end with the signing of an agreement. That is, in fact, only the beginning. The painstaking work of implementing such treaties is tremendously important. In fact, unless there is an implementing mechanism, like the non-nuclear program, the substance of agreements can be threatened by inattention or political reversals or diversion of materials or other dynamics. I appreciate so much your specific interest in these topics, your steadfast support for all the details of this work. I will do all that I can in the coming years to ensure that the non-nuclear program and other arms control initiatives maintain forward momentum. And to keep that momentum going, I've just completed a trip to 3 countries in Southeast Asia, which are illustrative of both the problem but likewise potential solutions. There is much talk, as you have seen in the press, about a so-called pivot of our foreign policy toward Asia. I don't want to emphasize that in particular because it's still a process of being worked out, although I went on board the USS George Washington in the Manila Harbor, and it has been out in that area for 6 months cruising around, offering some reassurance to Southeast Asian countries that are concerned principally about the Chinese and maybe overreach with regard to waters that are in dispute. But in any event, the purpose of the trip in this case was not to fight nuclear weapons, which they do not have, but to think with them about the detection of chemical and biological situations, to form a safety network in which we work together for peace through not only disarmament, but the prevention of armament to begin with. I think this is very important, and we had very good visits with the President of the Philippines and then their major officials, the Vice President of Indonesia, the President of Indonesia, and Sonny was at the Hajj, worshiping in a different specter than we are worshiping here today. Likewise, we had very good visits in Thailand, in a country that is booming, but is very, very close to danger in many ways and has problems in the southern part of its country, as those of you who know the Thais are aware. I mention all of this because it will need to be a continuing, ongoing pursuit. And I'm especially grateful to have this recognition of the Edward Snyder Award because it offers encouragement to continue on. Not the fight, but the study, the diplomacy, the talks, sometimes the prayers. I deeply appreciate this wonderful opportunity. I'm thankful for so many good Hoosiers who are in the audience. And that enriches the entire experience. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm Don Reeves, mostly a Nebraska farmer, but recently transplanted to Ohio. Most of the people here know that I've had a second career with Bread for the World on the issues of world hunger. Mm-hmm. And without detracting one iota from the topic of the evening, I would recall that Senator Lugar has been a leader in the struggles against world hunger, and in his other career as a Senate leader on the Agriculture Committee. So on behalf of all these folks and the Bread for the World folks, I thank you for that leadership as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me just thank you, sir, and agriculture is a very much a part of my life. I've been managing our family farm in Indiana for over 50 years after my dad passed away prematurely. And I told a group last night, the Competitive Council of America, who were meeting in the Franklin Room of the State Department, that when it comes to thoughts about productivity, entrepreneurship, initiative, agriculture in America is the heart of this. For example, on my dad's farm, when I was a boy out there pulling volunteer corn out of the soybean field and so forth, they were producing good crops of corn, soybeans, even in those days. But now in those same fields, same acreage, 604 acres in Indiana, we're producing 4 times as much corn in terms of bushels per acre than my dad was producing when I was a boy. Well, that's an important fact. We're not unique in that respect. But the breakthroughs in American agriculture have made it possible, marginally, to begin to think about feeding the world. That you really have to have that degree of productivity on the land that is available around this world, given the increase of population and the fact that more affluent populations are eating better or more, as the case may be. So I appreciate very much your point, because this is very much a source of world peace or lack of it. I visited last night with the former Egyptian ambassador to the United States. And one of the great problems in Egypt is not what we read about every day with Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood and the liberals and the military, but it's the fact that out of 80 million people back in the hustings, not seen in Tahrir Square, are a host of elderly people or children or what have you who really do not have enough food. And with the price of food rising, they do not have enough money to import the food. The government doesn't have enough money to offer the subsidies to the poor, which usually they offer just to keep people from being in unrest. This is a very serious predicament, quite apart from how the politics of the thing works out. So thank you for your cue and for mentioning agriculture.
And I wonder if you could say a word or two about what you think could lie ahead of us in drawing China into arms control and reduction talks.
Well, I believe it's very important that we have every contact possible with Chinese leaders, but also with Chinese business personnel, with people who are in academia. We're grateful that the United States is drawing tens of thousands of Chinese students who are coming to study in our universities. And we hope that at least we offer some good thoughts and influence in the process that they will take home in due course. As you know from your own experience, 20 years ago, Chinese students sometimes came to colleges in Indiana, but often they said, we're going to stay here. Our parents have told us it's not very safe, once you get out of China. But now the parents are saying, come home, because the opportunities are enormous. I don't want to overstate this, because the potential for difficulty is certainly there. When I was out there in Southeast Asia, I didn't visit with the Japanese government, but that government right now is in some turmoil, some political change, and their battle over some islands that are between the two of them is very severe. And the Chinese feel that the Japanese are rising again in a way they don't like, and so forth. We've got better chances in working things out with China and the Philippines, and this I discussed with the president of the Philippines, but it's still important. The Chinese are more aggressive. When I asked the Chinese premier when he came here last year, the previous one, just before this turn of leadership, just to be the devil's advocate, I said, in our country, the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. What's the situation in China? Are you commander-in-chief of the armed forces of China? So he smiled because he thought that I was trying to entrap him, I think. And he said, well, not exactly. I said, well, who does command it? Well, he said, the Communist Party commands both of us, and which is probably an honest answer coming out of this committee system. But this is something we're going to have to keep working at. Right now, I'm pleased that President Obama is headed to that area. He's going to go to Cambodia finally, the third of his stops, for this Southeast Asia conference. It'll be also attended by Vladimir Putin of Russia, and also by the new premier, as I understand, of China. And so these are opportunities that our leaders must seize to keep the dialogue going and to try to keep it into the commercial realm, the academic realm, ways that we can share in those ways.
Could you comment on the nuclear situation in Iran and the best way forward in that regard?
Well, there are reports even again today that the International Atomic Energy Commission believes that Iran still is making headway toward not a nuclear weapon at this point, but toward enrichment, higher percentages that are required in order to get up to a potential weapons grade level. At the same time, the economic sanctions, the banking sanctions that the United States has imposed, but likewise most of our European friends, even some others who are also involved in this, This is a real problem for the Japanese, a real problem for the Russians. They're not totally cooperative, but somewhat. They understand the dilemma. And the net effect, as perhaps all of you have read, is that the currency of Iran has plummeted. It's almost virtually worthless. The banking system under enormous stress. Now, the reporting is not all that good because our press people don't have access to exactly what people are thinking in rural Iran or outside the capitals that are more easily observed. But the suspicion is that there is stress, that people in the country realize that the whole world may not be against them, but on the other hand, things are getting very serious in terms of basic food, energy, and what have you. Iran is exporting now less than half of the oil that it normally exports. So its income has been reduced for its government, since this is the major source of this, very substantially. So this has led many to believe that we're on the threshold now of talks. Now, skeptics say, well, we've heard that again and again, and we have indeed, but it probably is more serious from the standpoint of the Iranians. Now, let's say we do get into talks. What might be decided? Some have suggested that perhaps the agreement is that the Iranians keep the level of their uranium at a low percentage level in terms of enrichment, that the rest of the world might be helpful in terms of nuclear energy, if that really is required in Iran, with some inspection level by international agencies. I stress all of this because I believe we're on the right track here. I'm not naive with regard to diplomacy and negotiation solving everything. But we, in essence, have said that it would not be a good idea for the Israelis to strike and attempt to knock out the facilities. First of all, because they do not have the equipment that can do that at this point. A great number of the experiments, or whatever the Iranians are doing, are buried underneath enough rock, far enough down, that this is going to require boots on the ground to go after, if that is the intent. So you could certainly make a statement, but it would not be definitive, and it's likely to have a reply. And in the midst of that area, already encumbered by the Syrian difficulties, quite apart from whatever is left of Arab Spring in other countries where the spring hasn't quite occurred yet, this is very volatile for anyone who is looking for peace. So this is going to require very astute diplomacy, and I believe in fairness to the administration that they have reacted carefully thus far, and I've supported that activity.
Senator, perhaps the most unhappy result of the current election is that you're not coming back to the Senate.
Oh, alas.
Oh, no. We will lose your leadership on the issues mentioned in which you have done such distinguished service. What are your plans when the term is over, and how will we continue to have your wisdom and guidance on these important public matters?
Well, on a public occasion of this sort, I fear I really cannot tell you. And this is not because I want to be circumspect, but we have rules in the Senate, and I don't disagree with it, that if people like myself, if you are interested in other pursuits and you want to have conversations seriously with others that might either employ you or be associated with you, you must report this to the Ethics Committee of the Senate within 3 days. Now, the Ethics Committee of the Senate is not particularly overt about all this. They publicize what they heard. So as a result, I've decided with regard to so-called serious talks, these had better wait until after January. But I have been visiting, and these are not controversial things, with the University of Indiana, with the University of Indianapolis, and these are ties I've had for some time. I think our archives, which are now boxed in over 900 huge boxes, and this is still mounting after 36 years of records and so forth, will go probably to Indiana University, although we've not reached the final contract on that, but we seem to be headed that way. And I'll have opportunities with these universities to make appearances on the campuses with students, to entertain them over here in Washington, or get intern programs moving for them, and other endeavors of that sort. Now, eventually, others have ideas. One has been suggested by the earlier question, that we might, in fact, organize a think tank of some sort that would talk about feeding the world and work really along the lines of worldwide nutrition that I've worked on for many, many years as chairman of the Agriculture Committee, or as ranking member, as the case may be, and still as a working farmer interested in these things. So that's a possibility, but that's down the trail. We'll have to wait until next year.
In addition to being disappointed that you won't be back in the Senate, I think we're disappointed that you didn't get to serve as Secretary of State. You would have made a great Secretary of State. On a night when we're celebrating your work, I hate to bring up a somber topic, but I'm going to. A few years ago, before he was ambassador to Libya, Chris Stevens came to FCNL. I believe he was working as a fellow in your office at that time.
Yes.
And we talked, David Culp and I talked with him about the topic that you just addressed, Iran and nuclear weapons. We were struck with what a thoughtful and centered man he was, and remarked on how fortunate you were to have him working with you. Now he has become a post-election issue. And I would welcome your thoughts about Chris, and also about this matter of his becoming an issue in the matter of who might be the next Secretary of State.
Well, first of all, Chris Stevens was a very important part of our office and of the Foreign Relations Committee during the year he served as a person fellow and was on my staff. And so I took advantage of this during the subsequent years. It was 6 years ago that Chris was with me, to continue visiting with him. He had other assignments in the State Department, then over in Libya during the Gaddafi difficulties and so forth. So I was heartbroken when I heard the news. It was devastating, because here was such an able diplomat, a person reaching out who really had a sense of the people of Libya and was making a lot of sense to them. But in answer to your question about subsequently, I fear, without, I hope, misstating anyone's position, that unfortunately this all came up during an election campaign and during really the final weeks of the campaign. And as a result, when Secretary Clinton, in a private briefing, she had just been over with the House members, she was meeting with senators. All senators were invited to the special secure spaces there to hear her. She spoke of a study that would take 30 days. Well, I must say, immediately some of my Republican colleagues rejected this totally. They indicated their disgust. This was a cover-up. That'll take us past the election. And you just simply are evading the whole business. And she was obviously very upset and very miffed, and so were they, and it was an imbroglio politically. And this has continued. In essence, it doesn't matter how many briefings we have. Some senators charge that there have been contradictions, that we never have heard enough, or that there still is doubt that the administration provided enough security for Chris Stevens and the other Americans who were killed, or others that were going to that area. I think that's a legitimate debating point there. The security system of the State Department with regard to consulates is going to be debated for a while. I talked to Ann Patterson, our current ambassador to Egypt, just this morning, because there were attacks on that embassy about the same time. And I said, how many consulates do you have in Egypt? He said, well, just the one in Alexandria. And I said, well, what sort of security there? And she says, well, virtually none. Essentially, the State Department has said if there's threat of attack, just get out of it. Leave the building. We can afford to lose the building, not the people. Well, this is not very reassuring. In other words, you set up a consulate which represents our country, which has records, business records, other, I suppose, passports, visa, or whatever the consulate does, and you just say if there's a threat, everybody abandon ship, go ahead and burn it down or take it out or what have you. So I think we still have some study and work to do here. And it's because the Arab Spring came upon us in a way in which we don't really understand as a country, all the cross currents that are proceeding in these countries. We didn't understand, I think, in Libya, that there are 18 armed militias, still armed. They don't respect the government of Libya, and as a matter of fact, there really isn't much of a security force thus far in Libya. It's still a government in formation. We could get rid of Gaddafi, but that doesn't substitute a constitution or some basis really for governance. So if you have 18 sort of separate governments, however small or large they may be, that's a very different predicament than the normal embassy, consulate, diplomatic situation. Now, having said all that, the Susan Rice question arises because of rumors that that is the president's first choice. May or may not be. I've been sitting next to John Kerry, our chairman, I'm the ranking member now for quite a while, and I don't betray any confidence that I think John would like to be Secretary of State, and thought perhaps it was his turn. He's been a good sport about this. I haven't seen him spouting off about the fact that he's being overlooked or so forth. Maybe he's not being overlooked. Maybe he still is the first choice. But for some reason, Susan Rice was asked to take on a responsibility, and that turns out to have been a real problem for her and for the State Department, maybe for the administration, namely 5 television shows on Sunday, in which she claims, and says as the president for that matter, in defending her, that she was given so-called talking points. And these were the administration's best information, I gather, about what had happened. And therefore, she was a loyal soldier and gave these 5 points or whatever. Well, as it turns out, they've been overtaken by other testimony. And that's been overtaken by other testimony still. So now we're sort of back to the thought that the administration was still in a process of either hiding things, trying to get it past the election, and so forth. Susan Rice may or may not be the victim of all of this, but she certainly is in the middle of it. And so I don't know how all that's going to be resolved. Suggestion, as you know, has been that, well, John Kerry could be Secretary of Defense. Maybe Leon Panetta is tired and wants to leave. And now, with all the problems of General Petraeus, which also get mixed up into this thing, they said, well, there's a position maybe over CIA. You might try that out for size. I was astonished. I won't say flattered, but I was astonished when some papers in Indiana, I don't think this is spread beyond this, but were suggesting that I might be available for any of those 3 positions. And I thought, no, I don't want to get involved in the Susan Rice predicament. No, I'm just looking forward to being with students at IU and UND. But that's about the best explanation I think I can make of this.
Senator, what turned you toward peacemaking and non-proliferation and disarmament? What in your life did that?
Well, I think there are several things. One of which was that I grew up as a youth in the Methodist Church, Central Avenue Methodist, went to Sunday school every Sunday. My parents took us to church every Sunday. Became involved when I got into into essay contests and speaking contests. I remember going over to DePaul University to compete in such a contest one time. And I believe that I was probably talking about world peace or something of this variety. And I still remember very much on my way home, I was sitting there in the front seat by my dad, and he said, "Now, Dick," he says, "I hope you really believe what you were saying," which is a rather sobering thought for a dad, you know, after you have been spouting off in oratorical fashion. But I became, in the Methodist Church, everybody is destined, at least in those days, to be a lay preacher, be prepared for that. And I've taken those opportunities very seriously. Even during years when I've been in the Senate, I've been invited back to pulpits and what have you. So I start really from that foundation, quite frankly. But at the same time, I volunteered to serve in the United States Navy. And I did so when I was at Oxford on the Rhodes Scholarship. One of the things that was disturbing to me as I visited with my fellow Rhodes Scholars in those days, and this is back in the early 1950s, was that we all had a so-called 2S classification, which meant that I remember when the whole thing started. We went out to Butler University in Indianapolis, took tests. If you got 70 or above, you got a 2S classification. You could go on to college for a year, and then you had to reapply again. But 69 or below, you went off to Fort Knox. This is a very dramatic thing for seniors at Shore High School. But in any event, I kept qualifying for 2S throughout 4 years at Denison, and then I went to Oxford. But some of my fellow scholars took the position, now what if we got married? What if we had children? What if we sort of worked our way past 26 years of age or whatever the limit was in those days, you know? After all, it would be a shame for leaders such as ourselves to be cannon fodder even before our time and all, and these sorts of rationalizations which disturbed me. So before I came back to the United States, I went to the American Embassy in London and volunteered for the Navy. And they said, "Well, Mr. Lugar, you seem to have a reasonably good academic record, but we can't guarantee you will get into Officer Candidate School, OCS." So I said, "Well, we'll take our chances." And when I got back, I was, in fact, ordered to OCS in Newport, Rhode Island, the following January. And so I did my duty there. I thought I was going to an aircraft carrier in Port Leoti, Morocco, in air intelligence. But instead, I was plucked out of obscurity because Admiral Arleigh Burke, who was Chief of Naval Operations, was setting up a briefing theater in the E-Ring of the Pentagon. And Arleigh Burke's idea was he would give the Navy point of view to congressmen and journalists and other people to combat perhaps his rival Curtis LeMay, who was Chief of Staff of the Air Force in those days. But so he was looking, I guess, for some talented young sprouts, and I was, as I say, plucked out of obscurity, went to intelligence school and went to the Pentagon, where my job was to come in at midnight, read the secrets of secrets, and give the intelligence briefing at 8 o'clock to the admirals and all that he assembled there. Then to go into the basement of the Pentagon and meet with the CIA people or NSA or so forth. Alan Dulles was then head of the CIA and other luminaries of this sort. This was a pretty heady business for a young ensign going on to Lieutenant JG in the Navy. But Admiral Burke himself sometimes slept on a cot in the Pentagon. And I was the only officer around, and he would summon me to his bedside. On one occasion, he said, "Lugar, who in the hell is Camille Chamoun?" He'd had a bad nightmare. And I said, "Well, Admiral, he's the president of Lebanon." Admiral says, "Thank goodness." He goes back to sleep. But in any event, this is quite a mentoring process but to get to your question, I understood from intelligence, from seeing Admiral Burke and our whole apparatus, the problems of war and peace, very graphically, day by day, how difficult it was for the United States to try to maintain peace, to maintain its alliances, to not make mistakes based upon some inadvertent news and so forth. And so by the time I got to the position of mayor of Indianapolis, I decided that we were going to take a more international point of view, and that was enhanced because President Nixon decided to come to Indianapolis, the first stop he made as a president, because we then had a mayor of the largest city that was a Republican. And he said, I told him he wanted me to go to NATO with Pat Moynihan, and they were having a cities conference. So, not lacking any boldness, I invited all the mayors of the world to come to Indianapolis, which 50 did the next year. And we really had a dialogue then in which our own citizens found their heritage as Slovenians or Germans or Russians or what have you, had lunches and dinners and so forth. And we began to think together about the role even a very inland city in Indiana could play in all of this. So when I got to the Senate, I wanted to be on the Foreign Relations Committee. I didn't get my choice the first 2 years, but ultimately I did get on the committee and progressed to become chairman in about 8 years later, and had remarkable opportunities with regard to the fight against apartheid in South Africa, quite apart from the Philippine election and democracy as it began in Asia, and then, of course, my work with Sam Nunn on non-Lugar, on things we've talked about today. So this is maybe more biography than you wanted to know, but this is sort of essentially where we're coming from. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Really wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing so much about yourself.